of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. It's a delight to be here with you this morning. Any of you ever have a dream, maybe when you were younger, that you had an exam in school and you arrived there and you couldn't find the right classroom? Ministers, I think, sometimes have the dream of showing up for worship and nobody else does. So I am delighted that you are here and we can share in these moments together. One of the great joys for many of us, I think, is coming across a book that captivates you, one that you just relish. It's the kind of book that seems to hold a treasure in almost every page for you. The kind of book you find yourself pulling off the shelf years later after the first time you read it, and it still brings great delight to you. This little book is one of those books for me. It's entitled, First You Have to Row a Little Boat, Reflections on Life and Living. The author, Richard Bodie, shares his love of sailing and what he has learned from sailing that has been helpful as he has journeyed through life. Well, actually, just the later part of his life, because he didn't write this book till he was 60 years old. He's often said it took him 60 years to write this book, to keep learning along the way. He offers insights by using this metaphor of sailing. Aha, that's why it's here. He offers us insights using this metaphor into life's challenges as well as opportunities in a way that is full of poetry and philosophy, wisdom and inspiration, so that many non-sailors have found it to be a wonderful read. For many readers, it has been course-altering. The title, First You Have to Row a Little Boat, comes from a conversation that Bodie had when he was 14 years old. He lived on Long Island, and he watched, all his early years, he watched sailboats glide by the harbor near where he lived. So he finally went to an old salty guy at a local shipyard and just went up to him and said, "Will you teach me how to sail?" And the old salt said, "You ever been in a sailboat?" "Nope." "You ever been in any kind of a boat?" "Nope." "Well, fella, the first thing you need to do is learn to row a little boat." This old gentleman was wise not only to the ways of the sea, but I think also to life. He knew that this young fella needed to learn some basics before he could move on to a sailboat and wherever the future would lead him. And I think this is so true of life as well, and particularly when it comes to our spiritual journey. The metaphor of a journey is very much a part of our sacred scriptures. And this morning I want to weave together this notion of learning as we go through life, through our journey of life, with a particular journey that the Israelites took, the one we heard a few moments ago that Leonard read about the Exodus. I invite you to join with me for a few minutes in pondering this incredible journey of the Exodus. Specifically, I want us to take a look at one aspect of this story, of this journey, and if it has any lessons that it might hold for us today. One of the ways that I like to explore the scriptures is what I call reading in the white spaces on the page. That is, reading between the lines, or even between the words, that white space. When I read the story of the Exodus, I am drawn to wonder what was going on behind the scenes. What was it like for those folks who were about to set off in haste on an amazing journey? What are we not told in scriptures that we might at least ponder and see what it says to us? I wonder, therefore, what it was like for them to have to choose what they would take on the journey with them when they had to make those decisions in haste. They had to leave Egypt pretty quickly. It may not be unlike what some are facing today out west as the wildfires approach their homes and they have to flee. What do they take and what do they leave behind? The Israelites had to make those decisions, so I wonder what it was like for them to look around their house in those last minutes or maybe an hour or so, who knows. But to look around and say, what will I need for this journey? What do I want to take, even if I don't need it for the journey? What can I possibly not leave behind? What must go with me? And therefore, what shall I leave behind? They probably also had to make a similar decision when it came to their livestock, very much a part of their livelihood. Which livestock were up for the journey and would be helpful in the journey? And which ones had to be left behind? Incredibly difficult decisions. Now, all we're told in the scriptures about this decision process is that Moses took along the bones of Joseph, for that was a promise that had to be fulfilled. That Joseph had asked his people, when you leave Egypt, take my bones with you wherever you go. And so that's all we know for sure, is that Moses took the bones of Joseph. So it leaves us wondering, what else did they take for that journey? Now, I'm guessing if they were anything like most Americans, they overpacked. As I read of their arduous journey, I wonder, as I read between the lines, if they took more than they really needed for the journey, and maybe even more than they could carry and manage on the journey. And I wonder if at some point they didn't start shedding some of those items they brought initially, left them by the wayside, because they realized, yeah, they're kind of nice, but at this point we really don't need them. They're not helpful to us. In fact, maybe they've become a burden. How did they come to realize what they really needed for the journey? That's our question this morning. What do we really need for the journey that we are on in our particular season of life? Now, this is a little bit of confession time. I have a lifelong fascination with luggage. Are you laughing because you do too, or what?
We're laughing at you.
Just laughing at you. Gary has tolerated it. I've had this lifelong fascination for luggage that is well made and made for specific purpose. At one point, I traveled about 100,000 miles a year in the air for when I worked for my denomination on a national level. I was traveling the country. And so I have a deep and abiding respect for the individual who created the rollerboard. I suspect this item has saved a lot of us from appointments with a chiropractor. It is so functional, and it does the trick. But I've also had some wonderful backpacks along the way. This one, for instance, was on my back when I climbed down to Phantom Ranch at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And amazingly, it made it up with me to the 11 and a half hours on the way back up. This is when I learned the value of packing light. What seems light at the beginning can become very heavy at the end. This little backpack has been on my back twice. I'm so grateful for it. When I walked in the footsteps of Jesus in the Holy Lands. And one of the things I've come to realize is that luggage, backpacks, can bring back wonderful memories. Places we've been and things we've seen, folks we've encountered. I appreciate luggage, backpacks, that meet the specific needs of a particular journey, a particular trip we're taking. So whether it's a suitcase or a backpack, it's nice to have something true, in fact, of the various seasons of our lives. What we need to carry with us and what we need to carry it all changes from one season of life to another. It's not necessarily the same throughout our whole lives. And thinking about how we pack for a trip can be helpful to us as we think about how we might pack for a particular season of life we're about to enter into. Each season has its particular needs and demands. Each season requires us to fill, we might say, our backpack with the items that are suited for that season. And yet I wonder how many of us are still carrying around things we really don't need and might be wise to let go of some of them. That certainly applies to physical possessions. What we needed in the past may not be what we need to possess in the future or even the present. For instance, as a lifelong sailor, I learned, much like the author here, Bodie, by starting very small. I began with an 8-foot rowboat that a neighbor let me earn by mowing his lawn for a whole summer. Then I bought a small sailboat, and a little bigger sailboat, and a little bigger sailboat. If any of you have been boat owners, you know how that goes. But then the time came when it didn't make sense. It wasn't right. Didn't fit our needs, even though it was part of our wants. It didn't fit our needs to continue to have a big boat. And that was a loss. And we grieved, in some ways still continue to grieve. But, and here's the really cool part, I have this boat. When we arrived here, within 2 weeks I went to the Meadows, to a lake over there, where the Sarasota Model Yacht Club was sailing radio-controlled sailboats. And I became fascinated. And I met an incredible group of folks that have become some dear friends. Our own John Metzger is part of our group. Bob Phelps is part of our sailing group. Sarasota Model Yacht Club is made up of folks, probably 80% have sailed all their lives and 20% have not, but we welcome everybody. We gather 3 times a week, as I said, and have a great time. This is the boat that I need at this point in my life journey. I don't need a 31-foot boat anymore. I've got a 39-inch boat. It's suited for this time of my life. And so possessions need to be looked at and say, is this what I really need? Likewise, I think we need to look at not only possessions, but also relationships. Some relationships that had tremendous meaning in the past may not be what we need in the present and future. Some relationships, maybe we need to let go of them. But likewise, some new relationships may be just what we need, and they need to be nurtured and developed and cherished. So sometimes relationships change as well as we move through the seasons of life. And lastly, but certainly not least, while we are packing for this season of life and what's to come, we might do well to look at what's in our spiritual backpack. What are we carrying with us as spiritual resources for the journey we're on? As a spiritual director, I found it can be incredibly helpful to invite folks to sort of conduct a survey by asking, what do we really need? What is it you really need to pack spiritually for this current season of life? For instance, you might ask, what beliefs have you long held that still work for you and are worth continuing to carry along in your journey? What still works for you? But also, you might ask, what beliefs have you outgrown or no longer work for you? What beliefs did you take on as a child or an adolescent that you've grown beyond maybe? And maybe you can let them go. What beliefs have you outgrown? And also, what new beliefs, new way of seeing things, new way of relating to God, new way of experiencing the Spirit of God, what new ways need to be fully embraced by you, for they work for you now at this stage of life? And what spiritual practices do you want to take with you into this new season of life? If you're a walker, if you like to walk, have you ever tried walking prayer or meditation? If you're a lover of nature, have you ever tried meditating on one small piece of creation as it moves through its seasons of life? For example, one time while I was on retreat in Vermont, I went up in the woods and I sat and I chose one leaf, and this was in October as the foliage season was in full bloom. And I found a leaf that was just beginning to turn colors, and over the next 7 days I went back to that one leaf and took pictures of it for the 7 days and captured its transformation from green to bright red. Simple things can be a powerful experience. If you're an introvert, have you tried a silent retreat? if you're an extrovert? Have you tried maybe reading to someone who's lost their eyesight? Have you considered a study or prayer or social justice group, or maybe spiritual direction? There's no end to the spiritual practices that we can pack in our little backpack for any particular season of life. So I want to ask you and invite you really to take some time this coming week and maybe do a little inventory about what you're carrying with you through life and what spiritual practices might be helpful to you for the season you are in. And there's one last thing I would urge all of us to pack. And this might sound a little strange at first, but given the world as it is, I would encourage us all to pack a spirit of gentleness, of kindness. I think our world needs that very badly, very badly. So yes, I'm thinking of gentleness toward others, but I'm also thinking of being gentle with ourselves, being kind to ourselves. We can be our own worst critic, harsh on ourselves sometimes. So I invite us to pack in our backpack a spirit of gentleness. For it seems that as we are more gentle with ourselves, it's easier to be gentle with others. It can make a world of difference if we all pack a spirit of gentleness. The quote from Mary Oliver, the poet, at the top of our bulletin this morning says, "Tell me what it is that you plan to do with your one wild and precious life." I would narrow that down just a little bit to this. What do you plan to do with this wonderful and precious season of your life? Wherever you are in the journey, it's never too late to make it a bit more wonderful and precious for each and every day. And maybe, like the Israelites, we need to let something go or pick something up more suited for the journey. So I invite you to ask yourself this week, what is it that you really need for this season of your life? And to do that with a spirit of gentleness. Amen.